Hi guys, so today we're going to be doing a very interesting interview with this man right here, Matt Judge, who is not only my boyfriend's brother-in-law, but also the CCO and executive principal of a global design and innovation firm, most known for designing the Apple stores. So it's going to be a good one, so let's get started.
Oh God. Pressure.
Okay, so my first question is, wait, let me roll it back a second. So usually I'm interviewing Americans about their idea about what it means to be American.
Yeah.
So you aren't American, or
Correct.
you're not American in the traditional sense.
Correct.
So how did you come to live in this country? Just give us a little background on that.
Yeah. And you wanted a bit more about education and things like that, about where my background in general,
Sure.
more broadly. So, I mean, as you said, I work for a design and innovation firm now, so I've always come from an art and creative background.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just make that very, very clear. I'm not coming from a political background or coming, but certainly in my role now, I'm responsible for helping to grow and sustain and build the business. So coming from a creative background, and I'll say a little more about that, but today my role is understanding globally how the world is moving economically and thinking about, as a business, how we can continue to evolve our proposition to stay relevant and to continue creating value in different parts of the world. So, but rolling back, I'm English, so I was born and raised about 100 miles from London. Spent the most formative years of my life in the west of England, and then went and studied at a university called Bath, which is a fairly prestigious school, but a really great school for someone like me who's very easily distracted because it's in a very quiet place. I studied graphic communication, graduated with a first, and then went on to work in London, which is what traditionally people do in my line of work. Kind of everyone flocks to London. So I worked in London for maybe about 8 years, and then I actually moved across to California. So this is my second experience of living in America now. I worked for Apple, based in Cupertino, for a little over a year. Ended up moving back to the UK for family reasons, and then continued to work for Apple remotely. But then started gradually, after setting up a business, actually started to then work with A-Tink a lot, and then that's how my relationship with A started. So about 6 months ago, so I've been working for 8 now for around 7 years, and about 6 months ago, Jess, who's Colby's sister, and my wife, we had our first baby, and we decided that we were going to move back to America. So very excited to be here, but at the same time, certainly it was a very difficult decision in some ways to move here, actually, given everything that's happening in the world right now. I think the thing that probably made it easier to move was the fact that the UK politically is going through such trauma, actually, with the whole Brexit negotiation and leaving the single market. So because there's so much happening at the home front, I think it made it soften a little bit coming across to another equally tumultuous sort of experience here now. So yeah, that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
So at its core, you really moved to the United States for business and personal reasons.
Yeah, well, so it's funny, when as a European, whenever you come to the US and you have to fill out the little blue form at customs, you won't have seen them, but you have to fill in this little blue form, and it makes you tick a box that says that you're here for personal or for business purposes. And it always trips me up, and I mean, as a European, you're always terrified going through US customs because they're so mean, number one, which is nothing like the British. We're so polite at customs, it's ridiculous. But they're so mean, and also you never know whether or not, especially with the visa stringency here, what you're supposed to tick. And I even have a visa, and I still get anxious about that moment. But you know, if I could tick them both, I tick them both, because first and foremost, what drove the decision was really a personal one. It was being here and being closer to Jess's family, especially having, you know, Bowie, an 11-month-old baby. You know, it's made it so much easier being close to family. But actually, on a professional level, it's really interesting to be here. Our company's headquartered here. This market is huge. It's going through such radical change with technology, and certainly, as you said, our companies known for designing retail, with the Apple Store, retail is going through such an amazing moment in America. There's so much spoken about how retail stores are closing, malls are collapsing, all this kind of thing, where the economy is shifting into a digital world. Actually, it's a very interesting place to be for us, to be redesigning and reimagining what the future of human interaction is in a country as liberal and as opportunistic as a place like America.
Okay, so kind of continuing on the idea of where you come from, ideologically, what was the perception of the United States as you grew up, maybe even before you came here? And then also, what was your perceptions kind of based in what your parents believed, either about the United States or about political ideology in general?
I think, so my background working a lot in branding and brand, I would say that kind of brand America was incredibly potent through my childhood. So I was born in 1981, so I'm kind of, I think I'm a millennial, or I'm just on that kind of the tipping point of it, so maybe I've got the benefit of seeing two sides of it.
So am I. I'm on the exact opposite end of the tipping point.
Of the other one. Do you know, I think it's a very interesting, I find it really interesting to be just on the tipping point of a millennial, because I grew up with books and I grew up with running around outside and, you know, trying to sneak calculators into exams. And then you kind of roll on 20 years and they, you know, everyone's got so much information at their fingertips, and, you know, maybe less of an outdoorsy kind of existence. It's an interesting time. But so my perception of America was probably shaped by that of brand America, which was MTV, which was Hollywood, Disney, you know. It was definitely defined by music, probably. So I've actually felt that the UK and America have always had, quote unquote, a special relationship. We're watching The Crown right now, but you know, that special relationship goes back, you know, many years through two great wars, where there has been a dependency upon one another, and I think as such we've probably, as two countries, have probably grown up a lot together. And my perception of America, like I say, stems from all the things that we've consumed, from Coca-Cola and brands like that, through to, you know, in the modern era, things like Facebook and Apple, brands that have kind of been figureheads or spearheads of technology, of innovation, of democracy actually in themselves. So I think that's where my understanding of it has grown. I think where there's clear differences are probably that the UK certainly leans more left in terms of its views of socialism. That's changing, sadly, you know, with the privatization of our railroads, with the privatization of public services, with the erosion of things like the NHS, which is probably, you know, one of the most beautiful institutions in the world, and most, you know, it really is at the heart of the United Kingdom. You certainly look at things like the NHS and there's just nothing like that here. You know, where there's always, with England, and certainly you'll find some people who will criticise the UK for this, but there's always feels like there's a safety net. If anything ever goes majorly wrong in your life, the state will support you in some way. So that certainly there's a difference there. So you could ladder that back up to political ideology differences maybe. But here, and certainly in this government, it's much more about standing on your own 2 feet and doing what you can, whereas in the UK it's definitely about helping people to their feet.
And that's definitely dependent on state as well.
Correct.
I mean, California is probably more like the UK than any other state in this country. You know?
Well, I mean, yeah, so and that's the other thing I'm very conscious of. I'm learning, and I've really, as we've had many conversations recently, I'm taking it upon myself since moving here to really understand and try to understand the political system here, because it's going to be so influential to my daughter's lifetime, and certainly for her development, for me to try and understand it. But California is the 5th biggest economy in the world, right?
Yes.
So it's only, and it'll be the 4th biggest next year, because once UK throws itself over this cliff, it's just going to, I think they've calculated $52 billion loss by 2030 for the UK. So you're going to see that change, and especially who knows with the tax laws that have been put in place, if the businesses reinvest and continue to grow, you will see California continue to move up that spectrum. So
I think that's actually a very important thing as someone who's moved to America. You, not me. The idea of federalism is so, I think, different, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm obviously ignorant about the UK's system, but the UK system of more like a parliamentary government where party lines are very organized and party members vote with their party, and essentially the winning party of the parliament really does control that parliament, I think is something that's quite different in the United States, because right now we have 3 branches of government that should be functioning in sync. They all have the same title, but clearly they can't function in sync because within the broader terms that we call our parties, there's such diversity.
Right.
And another thing I really like that you said about how you grew up perceiving the United States, about branding of the United States, is it's interesting because I feel like the perception that Americans have about Europe and about the UK is just, it's so old.
Yeah.
And it's so different, and that's interesting that you kind of brought up the things that we're known for are things that are have barely walked the earth, you know? They're things that are new, and they're things that are likely temporary. Even though at this time, you know, things like Coca-Cola feel in a lot of ways more powerful than government. And that power is probably growing. It is always shifting, and like what we're known for is always shifting because we don't have this lineage going all the way back the way that a country like the United Kingdom does.
I mean, America's is at a tipping point though, isn't it? Because Coca-Cola is become an institution and is in itself actually, Coca-Cola is becoming somewhat anachronistic because it's not young anymore. And I think that's the thing with America. It's relatively young comparatively, but in terms of being industrialized and you know, in the modern world, it's certainly not the new kid anymore, right?
Definitely not. No.
But back on the federal point, I think it's really important because, you know, then you could go on to an even greater extreme and look at India, which effectively is 18 countries that are bonded together.
Functions more like a subcontinent.
Right,
than a
exactly,
country.
exactly. And I think what's interesting about the UK, and why I felt easier about being here, because I mean, being really candid, and it's probably no surprise, you know, what Donald Trump is doing to America is soiling its position on the world. America, what's been so interesting is, despite this sort of monstrosity that is Donald Trump, it's much harder, certainly for someone who's not politically savvy like he is, it's much harder to actually influence and impact change. Of course, like I said, he can absolutely erode the well-being and sentiment of America
The perception,
internationally.
yeah.
Totally, because you know he's elected. You know he's an elected official, so of course he can do that. But actually, in terms of imparting and influencing change, he's restricted by the nature of this system, and that in some ways is a huge. And again, I think there's a lot of arrogance when people, certainly, I mean, British people are incredibly, I think, internationally and politically, there's a lot of misplaced arrogance with the greatness of Great Britain. I think, you know, Germany as well is doing very successfully right now and has a very socialist system. America's totally different to all of those countries. It is effectively a number of countries that are operating, you know, economically and even ideologically, lots of countries that are having to pull together and work together. So it is a whole different animal to govern. But I think that 3-party system, I don't know, I'm really intrigued to understand it more and understand how it can be successful, because through the Obama administration, international perception was that it was just a barrier. It was like 2 kids squabbling across the House. It's the House and the Senate, right?
The House and the Senate is one branch.
Then you've got the
judicial branch,
right,
which is the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court decides. So the fundamental nature of the United States government is derived from the United States Constitution. So that's already very different than the United Kingdom, because when a law is passed in the UK, that becomes part of a body of law that extends in the same way as every law that's ever been written. Right? It's added to this body.
Right.
And In the United States, we've only added, I think, around 27 amendments in the entire length of our time, and changing the Constitution is virtually impossible. So it has to be something like ending slavery. So with that comes kind of a bedrock of law, something above law, actually, deeper than law, that all Americans accept as truth. And then from that place stems the three branches of government, which is the executive, which in fact is supposed to be the weakest branch. Because if you think about the history of the United States, tyranny was a big fear. And then the congressional branch or legislative branch, which is the House and Senate, and the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. And the purpose and importance of the Supreme Court, and I think the UK actually just implemented one, like 50 years ago or something, is to check the constitutionality of laws. So law and constitutional rules are different in the United States, and in the United Kingdom, I believe, laws are added to a body that all laws are created as the law of the land.
But the Supreme Court, the law piece of that puzzle is there to look at the legality of something that's happening, right? But then ideologically, you could have a divided House and Senate, right? Which happened through the Obama administration. We had Republicans and Democrats, and they're not incentivized really to agree with one another, right? Necessarily. I mean, there may be some kind of crossovers of agendas, but to actually accomplish things through that two-party system
very slow
is really challenging, right? Unless you get into a situation where you have a Republican House and Senate.
But what's interesting is actually, historically, the most effective congressional leaders have been divided houses.
Really?
Because of horse trading. Because I want a naval base in my state and you want a national park in yours. Okay, we'll trade. What happens when there's a unified government, or that's what we call it when all three branches are the same party, is internal squabbling and the motivation to trade is reduced, because ideologically people become so hard fast, and that's what we're seeing right now. I mean, the primary agenda that Republicans wanted to implement the moment they got into office was drastically change healthcare, and they can't do it because they can't agree. And that's not to say they won't do it, but the power of the United States party systems is that even within parties, it's chaos.
Well, I think the healthcare issue is one that it really demonstrates how emotionally charged it is, because even if a single, you would have thought that I mean, there's no way that they would have come to an agreement with a split House and Senate on that, you know, with a Democratic Senate, you know, so that's one of those subjects that's going to be very hard to change no matter what, because so many people have been affected by it.
But certainly people said that about the Affordable Care Act under Obama, right? Even the fact that we changed in the Obama years, I mean, that was a divided government.
But I feel like the Obama years, I don't know, there was a watershed moment 2 years ago where with the rebirth of nationalism and protectionism, people suddenly stopped giving a shit about other people. I don't know, maybe, it just feels like through the Obama administration, America being the last industrialized country to adopt a common healthcare system, it felt like ideologically the right thing to do, right? And you know, and then you can start to argue rationally about it, but emotionally it felt like it was the right thing for America as such a leader of, you know, the leader of the free world, to demonstrate leadership and to demonstrate kind of, you know, progression. But now I just feel like, and this is happening globally, it's been a ripple that we've seen, we're just seeing people start to pull up the bridge, and you know, again, it's trying to wind back something that, again, you can talk about the rational foundations of it and the economic challenges of, and sure, no one I don't think would agree that Obamacare is perfect, but it was a step in the right direction.
And certainly a lot of people would argue it's imperfect because it had to be watered down to get passed in the first place.
Right.
A lot of people would argue that the original Obamacare, the original intentions that were brought forward were actually more perfect, and a lot of the flaws that people bring up about the system are the result of...
Totally. And you know, we sat at a dinner party recently, right, where there was an incredibly emotionally charged conversation around Obama.
Yes.
Yeah, it was very awkward for everybody. But you know, again, when we think about the brand of America and perception of America, certainly over the last 8-9 years, it was Obama. And you know, I'm an enormous fan of Obama because, and I'm very jealous of people who were fortunate enough to live here through his administration. Because again, and you know, again, that's perhaps a naive external point of view, but from an international perspective, what he did for the moral and social standing of America in the world was just enormous.
It's interesting because one of the largest criticisms of Obama upon entering the White House was that for the first year, he was out of the White House more than he was in it, right? He was traveling, he was making exactly that type of impression that you talked about. And many Americans, I would say about 50% of Americans were enraged. So it's interesting because the thing is, what Americans struggle with, I think, is that many people in this country believe in isolationism and believe that the role as this whole leader of the free world thing is not who we want to be, and that we would rather just be the biggest, best economic powerhouse in the world, and that the perception of other countries doesn't matter, and that we should pull out of all wars, and that we should just function as a powerhouse. What's confusing is that now the GOP houses all of these people, some of which are total war hawks, and would like to be isolationist and everything except violence. And then you kind of run into this ideological fallacy where you think, well, we're either in or we're out, right? You can't be starting wars in some countries and then not actively pursuing a global perspective in other avenues. Right.
I mean, look, I think Obama as well inherited a global perception of America that was, you know, Team America, the kind of the police of the world. And, you know, on the back of, which again, Britain is complicit to the problem, but on the back of Iraq and Afghanistan and again, I don't feel informed enough to talk about his international military policy because this is something my brother feels strongly about, the number of bombs that were dropped in Syria through his administration. But, you know, I think from a leadership perspective, which is something I'm very interested in, again, where I hold Obama in high account, what it looked like for me was he was trying to repair the perception of America on a global stage, remembering that America is the world's second biggest exporter. So it relies upon that. And again, great leadership is born from empathy. So you can't talk, like, I mean, it's so frustrating. You hear Donald Trump, was it the comment he made last week about these shithole countries? And again, it's you know, who knows, it sounds like there's 2 or 3 sources have corroborated that, but who says stuff like that as a leader? And we're talking about, you know, African immigrants have scored consistently higher in academic achievement in American colleges than naturalized westernized students. So where does this supreme arrogance come from, that because we're white or because somehow we were born in these places that we're somehow superior? That is not leadership, and that's not what you saw. Again, it just feels like he's taken us back a step, where Obama worked so hard to have America remembered and ranked amongst those countries in the world that are really pioneering and leading what it means to be inclusive, what it means to be empathetic, what it means to be socially and morally responsible. So that's, you know, you can talk a lot about, well, maybe he neglected his home turf, but, you know, I think that what he did for America internationally was incredible and very powerful and very brilliant in terms of building allies for a country that so heavily relies upon exporting its product.
And I think that perhaps from an educational perspective is where Americans get lost, because it's kind of been proven that Americans are very good at having opinions even on things that they don't fully understand.
Right.
Actually, human nature is to have very strong opinions even on things you don't understand. I won't put it on America as that's fault,
right.
But I do think that the acceptance of a global economy, the acceptance that we are interconnected with people we'll never meet, is very difficult for people who grew up in towns of less than 5,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so not that they're right, but that their experience, their perception of the world has indicated to them that it's counterproductive, when perhaps maybe on a larger scale for the United States as a whole, it was very productive. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think hope can be both a potent and destructive force. It just depends on how it's applied. Is it America I read it ranked 28 in terms of education globally, and number 1 in terms of confidence. So, you know, you can draw some interesting correlations with things like that. So you have a situation now where there's just been, because of, in the UK, you've had years of austerity, which have meant that basically people are paying at the bottom of our population pyramid, the lowest income, highest volume, are effectively paying for the mistakes of the people that have made at the top, certainly since the crash, the financial crash. So America, like the UK, opted to bail the banks out, right? So we've had this situation now since that economic crisis where ordinary working people have been effectively penalised for the actions of extraordinarily well-off individuals. And
you mean like irresponsibility of people who controlled the banks?
And
or?
It was Iceland, right? He opted to not bail out the banks, and their economy has bounced back actually now, and is actually growing now for the first time since that. So it took 10 years, less 8 years, but in those 8 years, it's seen already resurgence, and it didn't come at the cost of their people. Whereas the UK and to an extent the US are still suffering from what their political decision was that protected the interests and the needs of those wealthy, but also then destroyed those. And certainly a middle class, in both the UK and the US, we've seen this erosion of our middle class. Wealth transferring up, greatening of our lower working class. So there was a perfect moment for somebody like Donald Trump, for somebody like in the UK, Nigel Farage, to divide people and to use misinformation and fear. And we've not even spoken about social media.
You could go there if you'd like.
Well, maybe we will, but they've used those kind of channels and platforms to control people and to manipulate people to a place where we are now, where it just feels like the most divided that we've ever been socially. You know, and I guess
not in this country.
Perhaps, right? People still have flags that talk about that.
And the crazy thing about the United States is, if you look at our history, I mean, Americans have always hated other Americans. There has always been deep hatred across state lines, across party lines. I think the political hatred is something new, actually, that you can announce you're a Democrat and be attacked at the throat, or announce you're Republican and be attacked at the throat. I don't think that is traditional for this country, but hatred and vitriol are absolutely traditional for this country. I mean, every era, civil rights era, Civil War era, I mean, all of those eras were a battle of the perception of what does it mean to be a member of this country, and what kind of individual responsibility do I have? Because what I've really noticed is that Americans as people, individuals, are fun-loving, great people. Wherever you go, I've been to the Deep South, and it's the same. And obviously I'm a white person, so that's, I don't know if I can fully ever understand. But collectively, Americans, the mob mentality in America is particularly potent, I'd say. Like, the collective action of Americans can get hateful very quickly. And perhaps it's because we're so big and we don't feel accountable. I'm not sure what drives that, but it is actually traditional in this country to be hateful towards each other and to have true division.
Well, there's an anthropology theory that once a tribe got to, I think it's 100 people, a new tribe would form, because what they saw was that once those tribes got to 100 people, what you started to get, certainly 100 plus, you would start to get murder. You would start to have fighting, mistrust. And it stems from a belief that, I think it's something like, you can only trust 100 people. I'm getting this wrong now. I'll find it and I'll send it to you, but there's a statistic that you can only know 500 people and you can only trust 100, or somewhere around there. So that's why this kind of the splitting. So we're talking about base biology and kind of the human condition. I mean, it's just incredibly hard, and you're trained. It's a natural feeling to fear the things that you don't understand or you don't know. So again, this is just biological. These are things we have to try and over years. This is where racism has to be educated out of people.
But at the same time, I'd argue that people are trained to be racist.
Unquestionably. But there is.
But tribalism, some form of tribalism,
right.
is inherent. Yeah,
right.
I'd agree with that.
So I think that's the challenge. Is in the UK, people in Scotland. This probably stems back much further. People in Scotland almost always jokingly hate the British, the UK. Welsh equally have a firm dislike. The Cornish would wish they had their own flag and an identity. And then Ireland is even worse situation because of the degree of occupancy that we've had there. So in the US it's probably no different to San Francisco and LA have a kind of a rivalry, right? Sydney and Melbourne have a rivalry.
Well, a large part of the United States thinks that San Francisco is like a devil worshipping city. Legitimately.
So I've never seen. I'd love to see. I'm so curious to see more of America.
Yeah, because it's very different.
Yeah, I mean, I went to South by Southwest, and obviously Texas is quite a deep red state, right? Apart from Austin, which is very liberal, and it's just interesting to hear different perspectives.
Definitely. The thing about Texas isn't even as red as it gets.
Right.
I mean, if you want to. Like, if you go to Alabama,
I was just gonna say
you will feel like you are in a different country.
Right. Yeah.
Like, truly a different ideological perception of the world.
Right.
But I would also argue, like, that is America, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that it's easy to say we love diversity when it's the type of diversity we love.
Right.
Like, it's easy for people in Marin to say, like, oh, we love all races, we love all sexualities. Okay. But there's other types of diversity, and there is a balance between I won't be tolerant of intolerance,
right.
but I do want to seek to understand and embrace that diversity, because I do think it can be a positive check on maybe the extreme views on the other side of the political spectrum.
Right. Right.
And like they exist because of each other.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, in the UK through Brexit, the parts of the country that had the lowest number of immigrants voted most overwhelmingly against Brexit on the grounds of immigration. So people who there were no their
voted
jobs
against Brexit.
For.
Oh, okay.
So people whose jobs were not threatened by immigrants, people who had their NHS in their home counties, and there were no additional doctor waiting times because of immigrants, were the ones that said that they wanted to vote for Brexit, to leave the single European market, to stop the movement of people because of immigrants.
Right.
So again, this comes back to this sort of London, the most diverse city I've ever experienced, had the lowest number of people that voted and the highest education in the country, voted the most overwhelmingly to remain in the single market and valued immigration. So that again, it comes back to this isolationism, protectionism, nationalism, that we sort of this ripple that we're seeing now going around the world.
Right.
But I know that one of your questions is going to be about how I would describe America. Do you want to save that for the last question?
It's up to you. It could be the last question now. If it's up to you how much time you have.
I can talk as long as you want. But
okay, yeah.
I mean, the word that always comes to my mind when I think of America, and I think you said it during this conversation, was it was the one of the words that has to be illustrated on a wall, but is hope. And like I say, hope can be a dangerous thing, and it can also be the most potent force. And I think that hope is born from knowing that here, with the nature of the country and how it was founded and how it has evolved, that there is power in the hands of its people. And again, this was something that was underlined by Obama as he left office. You know, don't boo, vote. That kind of mentality that you can change things and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things and change things. I think that's very much more prevalent here in America than I've seen it anywhere else in the world, where hope is always vested in others. You know, you have to, in the UK, you have to believe in your government. In the Middle East, you have to believe in your sheikh and your sovereignty. Here in America, you have to believe in yourself. And I think that's something that's quite different to anywhere I've seen anywhere else.
Wow. That's a very interesting and like powerful perspective for me to hear. Because I do think that's true, you know. I think growing up in the United States, most people believe they're going to make waves.
Mm-hmm.
Even people who have a different idea of what kind of wave, but most people have very strong feelings about politics and very personal accountability and responsibility for those feelings. You know, people are very actively engaged in fighting and working, and that's really, I think, been the lifeblood of all major change in this country.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the legislation, I think okay, if I had to answer that question,
Please.
I would say institution. Because the way that the United States is built is so much more powerful than its people. That's what I think. I think Americans are great. I'm very proud to be American. I love this country, like, deeply. But I think the most powerful thing was that the way this country was born and built from its conception was so incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the institutions are so incredible, and the accountability that we have to our leaders is a result of that institution, and that, I think, is actually where hope comes from. Because, you know, there was a trend for a while when Trump was elected to say, not my president. And then there was a second trend to say, scratch that, you are my president, and that means you work for me, and I'm going to raise hell until you represent people like me. And I think that's a very American way of handling it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm. Yeah, no, totally. I think it's my only problem with the word institution is that when I think of on a micro level, when I think of institutions in terms of a business sense, institutions are rarely the ones that are changing the world or innovating.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in America, if you want change, you have to vote, you have to fight, or you have to make the change you want to see.
Mm-hmm.
But all three of those things are options.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, I think it's very. I think when I think of institution, I would think of Russia, say, where it's and I know what you mean by it, because I'm being provocative, but
right.
It's a country that you don't. It's actually maybe democracy is just an idea that wasn't meant for everywhere, but you look at a place like Russia, that genuinely is an institution that doesn't allow for radical change because it's so controlled by the institution.
So I think what was mind-boggling to me when I learned about the history of this country is that wealthy white men sat down and designed a system that has lasted through every tumultuous moment, every addition of different racial populations, very well in the long term. And actually, I would say the reason why I think we will thrive and survive through Trump is because the institution is designed for young people and poor people and diverse groups of people to become very important to the creation of law and life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's true, maybe it's the absence of institution, but I do think the design of government in this country is spectacular. I mean, I look at it in awe that people who didn't even have a country created one out of paper,
right.
And people said, okay, and played along in a way that was not weak and submissive, but played within the rules that we all agree upon in a very aggressive and personal and fired up way. And that continues to be, I think, the way that the United States is. And I think if you want to go down the social media path, that's what scares me. Is, I recently watched, because today is Martin Luther King Day, I watched, or is Sunday? Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Doesn't matter. They don't know. But I watched a movie called Selma. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's about Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
And I thought, how many of us would get up off our couch and go walk in a march where we could die? And how many, I don't think many.
No.
And how many, because then I was thinking, oh, maybe something like that is the Women's March. But then I thought, how many of those people were risking their life? Practically none. And how many of those people were there to share that online? That's what I always think, but that's my cynical
But you know what?
perception of social media.
Again, I've got, you know, of all races, ethnicities, this, I think desperation can be an incredibly powerful weapon. Again, I don't know how it's used and its relationship with hope, but I would like to think that if your life almost wasn't worth living, then dying is, I think there's a Latin term of analepsis, nothing to lose, nothing to fear.
But the thing that was so shocking to me about the civil rights movement is it succeeded because people who had everything to lose, white pastors,
Right.
white people who were successful,
Right.
came and, I mean, white pastors died in the streets
Right.
because they felt such a moral call.
Right.
I think that's, I mean, watching that movie, I was just almost in shock, like, that people could be so faithful to God and so faithful to a higher moral cause that they would go do that. I just don't, like, I don't think I know anyone like that.
So I had a conversation with a sociologist, a retired sociologist. Actually, he lives at number 10 or something on the street, so you could always speak to him about it yourself.
Yeah.
He believes that countries with a strong religious position, so like America, are more likely, he believes, to overthrow or to challenge the systems that govern them.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, to your point, you're only ever held accountable to one thing, and that thing is a higher being and purpose than anything that's man-made that's in between you.
And I think the interesting thing about the way growing up very much going to church and being part of that part of America, is that American Christianity is very different than, say, Mexican Christianity. Like, when I go to a Mexican mass in Mexico,
Is that a frequent event?
No, but I've done it several times.
Really?
Yeah, because I traveled to Mexico to work on projects there, but the emphasis on acceptance, or that you're going to a better place, so all that happens is just temporary. I mean, one of the most powerful conversations of my life was a woman explaining to me that I traveled to a dump, that is where many people live, because we were working on a project. Basically, it was being proven that toxic waste was working into those people's water supply, and children and people were dying very, very young. So we went and talked to those people, and she said, well, my son died, and I said, I'm so sorry, blah, blah. And then she explained to me that the emergency services of the government couldn't get there. She said, but, you know, my son's in a better place now, and I'm so grateful to God for getting me through these times. And I thought, that is a different level of faith and a different breed of faith than you have in the United States. Because in the United States, sure, people would say he's in a better place now. But they would also say the emergency services that didn't get here are never going to miss another kid dying. And there would be a community of people calling congresspeople. And that, I think, because there's actually a lot of people, a lot of sociologists who say that religion is a force for keeping countries poor.
Right.
Economically poor.
Right.
But I think in the United States...
Is it blind faith because of...
Yeah, and because they believe truly that perhaps they have all they need. And that is not the American breed of Christianity. I mean, there are biblical scriptures that say you cannot serve money and the Lord at the same time.
Right.
So America's kind of unique in the way that we participate in Christianity.
Yeah.
And no one in America is saying, oh, I believe that the person I didn't want to get elected was meant to get elected. So I'm just going to pray on that and hope he does a good job. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I do think you're in that weird place here. I mean, again, candidly, I'm not particularly religious, but unless I'm in real trouble, and then you know,
Yeah.
I think like most people, or a lot of people my age.
Yeah.
But then you have, there's nothing more infuriating when you see leading politicians on Twitter asking to pray for something after a national atrocity, like gun crime, or like some kind of a massacre. It's pray for the families of the victims. It's like, don't pray for them. Like,
Yeah.
change something, do something.
Sure.
But
I do think, though, that I'm not saying this about politicians, but there are people who truly believe that a prayer is the best thing you could give someone.
maybe.
But a prayer and help, right? I think, so here's the thing. There's Christians who go to church to get on a moral high ground. And then there are Christians who live like Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read the Bible, and I can tell you for sure that Jesus would have gone to the poor communities, would have fed the poor, would have touched sick people, would have risked himself to save others.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, he would have fell on his knees and prayed, but then he would have gotten up and helped people. I mean, if you
Right.
read the Bible, it is stories of people going and doing what they believe was in the light of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I think, for me as a person who's had a lot of experience with Christianity, it's almost sacrilegious. I mean, do you know Jesus? Jesus was not typing up a Facebook post about how nice he is.
Right. Well, I think again, like how religion is used.
Yeah,
especially
it's
in politics.
horrible. I mean,
See,
it's
like,
actually horrible.
So Mark Zuckerberg, and maybe we'll come full circle on the social media, but Mark Zuckerberg has just he's announced recently that he is converted to Christianity, or that he's gone from an atheist to a believer now. Now, the cynicist in me would look at that and say, okay, so you've got the most powerful man in the world, I believe, right now, based on the manipulation that he can use his media platform to do, and it is a media platform. That's exactly what it is, because it creates content. The power that he has, the wealth that he has, the influence that he has, and all of a sudden now, and as a naturalized, born American, he's now coming out to say that he's a Christian. I guarantee you, in 10 years' time, he'll run for president.
I was just going to say that.
He's going to do it, and it's terrifying. I think Americans
Yeah.
should be afraid of that, because he's not. I don't think he's a good guy, but he's using religion because you have to be. What? So was it the last Catholic American president was killed, right? I mean, yeah, we. I don't know if this is the rabbit hole you want to go down, but it's interesting to see how things like religion gets used. Again, it's something that, from an external perspective, America is a very religious place because of how it uses religion. But yeah, perhaps that goes to shape my understanding of it as a country.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe going back a bit more directly to this, but that is how I think the world perceives American in a lot of ways. Like, the very Christian part of America is a part of its identity. I don't know too many industrialized nations whose presidents get up and say, God bless, da-da-da.
Right.
I mean, that's like, you have to say that.
Right.
And it's written into the words of this country.
Yeah. I actually don't believe that. You know when Donald Trump says that? He's such a narcissist. Do you think Donald Trump believes in God?
No.
I don't think he believes that there can be anything greater than him. I honestly believe he believes that.
Well, yeah, maybe.
He's famed for his his narcissism. It's so interesting. Anyway.
Well, I definitely don't think that Donald Trump goes home at night and falls to his knees and asks the Lord to give him guidance on how he should best lead his people. No.
Right.
Absolutely not.
He's got Fox News on. He's too busy. Too many things to do.
Oh my. Yeah.
What else do you need to know?
Well, my last question was going to be what do you think it means to be American?
Yeah.
So I think you've given me a ton.
Should we sing
Thank
the
you so
national
much.
anthem?
Do you know it?
I don't know it. And there, so is there, if to help me as a Brit in America, what do you think, what's the most important things for me to understand America? The Constitution,
The Constitution is a big one, because the thing about the Constitution that is beautiful is it is unifying.
Right.
People do believe, I would say almost everyone, believes that's what made this country great, and that's something you just don't touch.
Right.
So yeah, the Constitution would be a good place to start. It's not a fun thing to read.
Is it on an audiobook? And one more question.
Yeah.
Who do you believe is the greatest living American, and why?
Like the most American, or just the best person?
Well, I'm sure that the reason why. Well, I was leaving it open, and I wanted to know why you thought that they were the greatest.
I would say, do you know John McCain?
Yeah.
Senator John McCain?
Yeah.
I really respect Senator John McCain.
He's Republican, right?
Yeah.
Has he got a brain tumor?
Yeah, he does now, which is like a national tragedy, and I'm sure when he dies it will be like national mourning. But the reason why is because, first of all, he respected Obama so much in the election. I have this clip in my head of this woman getting up and saying, I'm sure you've seen it, and him saying, no ma'am. Obama is a family man. Obama and I don't agree on basically anything, but I respect the heck out of him. And I think, honestly, as someone who doesn't actually really identify as Democrat or Republican, because I don't think any person except a sheep could agree with everything a party says.
Right.
I really think that if conservative America wants an example of how to be conservative and still be kind and still respect others, it's John McCain.
Right.
I think also he was a military hero. I mean, he really put his life on the line for his values. He served out of the limelight for a long time. He believes hugely in the respect of law and the respect of institution. He respectfully disagrees with people. He's very open to debate. He went against, a lot of people would argue it's because he's not going to run again, but he went against his party on a fundamental vote for healthcare for Americans.
Right.
You know, he is a patriot in the sense that he seems to me more indebted to his country than his party. And how different would this country be if more American leaders thought that way?
Right.
I just think that's powerful, that whether or not I agree with him, his conviction comes from within.
Yeah.
And he's incredibly intelligent and incredibly well educated, and uses that opportunity and that access to education to fight for what he believes in a respectful and positive way. So yeah, I definitely don't agree with everything he says, but I think in terms of what American leaders should look like, he's a great example.
Yeah.
And I think, the election years between McCain and Obama were proud years.
Yeah.
Because they were so different, but they were two stand-up guys on a stage debating about things that were issues instead of fighting like children.
Right.
And so it felt like, well, obviously everyone has their one that they preferred, but it felt like we're going to be in good hands. Both these guys respect this country, respect its people, and want to do well. Their perception of how to do well is different, but they're not doing it to say they're president.
No, and it's intrinsic, but it's not driven by a motivation of self.
Right.
I think, again, which is where the Donald comes in. It's just really everything's done for the betterment of him. Psychopaths are proven to have zero empathy, and I see that in him. That there's not a single decision that's been driven by the betterment of America. It's all for the better of Donald and Donald's peers, and if it can better them, then the hope is that they can somehow top down influence the rest of the market.
That's how they sell it.
Yeah.
I don't know if they believe that, but
well, it's just
it doesn't matter if they believe it as long as their followers do.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, is that a good answer to your question?
That's a great answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's so many great Americans. Like, as I said before, and I think I'd like to say this on camera, because I think it's easy through this project that people will see me picking at the flaws of this country. But I'd like to think I pick at the flaws of this country in the way that a mom's looking at their kid and saying, shape up, clean your room, do this, do that, because you truly love and want the best for this country. And I'm so grateful to live in a place where I can be 18 years old, get on a camera, say my opinion, and no one's gonna come knocking on my door and tell me to be quiet.
There's a great quote that's, people would rather be ruined by praise than saved by criticism. And I think it's hard to hear sometimes, and my job a lot of the time is putting a rather ugly mirror back at businesses and companies and telling them where the problems are. But the reality is that unless you are critical of what's happening around you, and unless, you know, too much back patting and that's where businesses and countries stop innovating and stop challenging and stop striving forward for better, because everything can always be better. So I think it's important that your generation, my generation to an extent, but certainly yours, and have to keep challenging and keep pushing and keep questioning, because you're only going to understand it and you're only going to improve it from doing that. So yeah, don't be afraid of challenging and pushing and critiquing, because that's where innovation and change is born.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Yay. Done.